So yeah, I'm mainly going to be talking about the Reading on Screen project, which was meant to be a very clever pun or double meaning. So with the idea of the fact that many of us now are increasingly reading on screens, but also the fact that the project to which that refers specifically was based around the idea of creating films about reading, short films about reading. That's, as I say, as you can see here, so it's kind of the idea of talking about things like the emergence of e-readers, and then this is a screening from one of the workshops that we ran where the participants sat and watched the films that they made. So I was going to start by maybe giving a little bit of background to the project and explaining, maybe as I'm in a language and communication seminar, why it doesn't really focus on language per se, and sort of approaches reading from a slightly different angle. And then I'll talk in more depth about this project and show some of the films that we made, and probably leave ample time for questions and maybe a bit of discussion. So as I say, the sort of inspiration for, or why I became interested in this sort of area which I call digital reading, was really two strands to it. I mean, I've always been interested in technology and literature, particularly since the sort of 1990s, when I started using email and got interested in things like hypertext, fiction, and so on. And so I was really interested in the idea of reading on screens and the arrival of e-readers. So I think I first encountered this with the Sony e-reader and found it kind of quite clumsy and didn't like the fact that I couldn't take notes and all the rest of it, and so I thought that's never going to catch on. And then the Kindle arrived, and I just got really interested in the things that you could do that you can't do on a book, and vice versa. So sort of thinking about the kind of different affordances of digital devices. And also, I suppose I started to get quite frustrated by the sort of moral panic around all of this, and the idea that somehow, reading books were all going to disappear. And in the course of some of the projects that I've done, I have literally been shouted at by people who can't even countenance the idea of sort of even talking about reading going digital. And I often find myself sounding like a bit of an advocate or a salesperson for Amazon, but I'm not. I mean, I think e-readers and books can coexist alongside each other perfectly happily, and I still have a house full of books. But as I say, I'm just interested in kind of thinking about, rethinking reading, I suppose, as I've experienced it on a new device, on a new format. And the other reason I was interested in digital reading was I became interested in fan fiction, and from that I started to look at online book clubs and literary communities. And one that I've particularly spent a lot of time looking at, which has been going for about 15 years, I think, is the Republic of Pemberley, which is an online community for people who love Jane Austen. And I've written quite a lot about this particular community. And again, I suppose the sort of two interests were also to do with the fact that, teaching literature and teaching reading, often you find people are reluctant to read and often turn up to seminars not having read what you've asked them to read. And also, I think, find it difficult sometimes to talk about reading. And talking to some of my colleagues, it was quite interesting to discover that teachers of literature often would reveal that they were the quiet people in the classroom who didn't want to talk, had to be forced to contribute, and I was one of those people. So I was interested in thinking about whether the digital would, rather than stop people reading, whether it might open up new spaces for people to read. And also I was quite interested in the idea, particularly of online communities, what it would be like in those communities to be able to take your time to say what you wanted to say, and then to write your response so you could reflect on it and share it with others when you were ready, and what kind of difference that might make in terms of the kind of interactions that people might have. So that led to the sort of first project, which was researching readers online, which was funded by the HRC, and it was short-term project, 6 months, what they called a development award, and what was then called the digital transformations theme. And this was really the first time that myself and a colleague from Bournemouth, Julia Round, had sort of tried to research reading. And so it was very exploratory. And from that, we then were lucky enough to get some more funding from the HRC for a research network, which we called the Digital Reading Network. So the research network, the aim of that was to bring people who were researching reading, sometimes audiences from multiple disciplines, together to again explore how we might respond to the changes affecting reading, and particularly to explore different approaches and methodologies. Because myself and my co-investigator Julia, we both come from a kind of literature background predominantly. She's a comics scholar, and my research is kind of contemporary literature and digital literature, I suppose. And so we were just interested in sort of learning more about other ways of thinking about researching reading, and particularly engaging with real readers. So the kind of themes underlying this was, the two projects really were to start thinking about the impact of digitisation on reading and readers, I suppose, because a lot of our work did involve talking to real readers and listening to their experiences and often their very strong feelings about this. That was the thing, said one of the things that's to really retain my interest in this, the fact that people are so passionate about reading. Yes, people may have quite strong views about music going digital and so on, but reading, I think, takes it to another level. As I say, because of that sort of very strong attachment people have to books, to their memories of reading. And so the first two projects, because it was under the digital transformation theme, I guess one of our rationales for the project was the idea that, having sort of seen the sheer amount of activity around reading that you could find in these digital spaces, why wasn't anybody doing anything? And particularly in the context of digital humanities, big data kind of methods, the possibilities for doing something like a social network analysis on one of these online communities, and mining data, if you want to put it that way, about readers just seemed to be something that we wanted to kind of look into. So as part of the Digital Reading Network project, we held a workshop where we had a couple of people come to talk to us about visualization and social network analysis and so on. But it was really also sort of engaging with, as I say, methods from other disciplines, particularly sociology, media studies and so on. So in the first project we used an online survey where we sort of posted it on various online forums, and we had about 250 responses, I think, asking people, why do you come here to talk about reading, asking them a bit about themselves, that kind of thing. And we also did a couple of focus groups with local book club members, librarians, writers, some of our students, so again just to get a sort of cross-section of different people invested in reading, to sort of hear their views. So we tried, and that was kind of inspired, I suppose, by some of the research on reading and some early research on digital reading as well, which had kind of advocated this mixed methods approach, so rather than just adopting one method, sort of exploring possibilities, or exploring the question, I suppose, from different angles. And I guess as a sort of context for how we were thinking about reading, I mean, first of all, it was mainly reading for leisure or pleasure, I suppose, and a lot of our focus was probably on reading of fiction and novels in particular. But we also wanted to sort of locate reading, particularly in the digital context, as something that can be an activity that is shared with other people, the idea of readers not just being kind of passive consumers of content, but also people who may want to respond creatively, as in the case of people who may write fan fiction based on their reading and so on. And thinking of reading as a sort of participatory activity. So again, if we look at the sort of digital landscape, this is an example of a bookstagram. I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but the idea of a bit like foodstagramming, where you take a photo of your lunch and post it so that other people can see what you're eating. People post whatever they're reading at the moment, often with cats and candles and flowers.
Yeah, everybody who does that.
Yeah? Yeah, it's a very popular activity. And can also generate conversations around reading. People often mock these kind of things as very superficial, but there are ways in which they can generate meaningful discussions. You've got booktubers and influencers and so on, like Zoella, who's I think published her own works of fiction, but also, if you've ever watched booktubers, that they often are surrounded by masses of books that they've been paid to talk about. And there's a sort of, I think one of the things I'm currently writing about, I suppose, because I'm writing a book about literature and social media, is the visibility of reading, and the ways in which people, don't have to just talk about reading, but can actually share their reading visually with other people, and actually want to have that sort of social contact, to find other readers who may share their interests, but also sometimes just to kind of self-identify themselves and celebrate the act of reading. So it's not always looking for connections. Sometimes it's just, if you love reading so much, you want everybody to know. And Goodreads, obviously, is another example of another fairly recent digital space that has grown up from things like fan communities to allow people to, again, display their reading, quantify their reading. People set themselves, goals of reading 100 books a year and so on. But also, if you're so minded, to find other readers and to read reviews by ordinary readers. So yeah, it was in the context of this, thinking about reading in the context of the digital, but also I think for younger readers in particular, that sort of shift into a space where perhaps the reading of books and the watching of films and the playing of games, they're not conceived of necessarily as the kind of separate activities we might have thought of them as in the past. So in the context of that kind of idea of media convergence. So reading on screen kind of developed out of, in a sense, perhaps a decision to move away from the kind of big data approach and the kind of quantification, and explicitly not to do work on the idea of sort of the cognitive processing of information and comprehension that a lot of work on reading tends to do. And also I should mention that this project was what the HRC called a follow-on project. So it was actually supposed to be all about public engagement and not a research project per se. But it did continue, I think, for me, one of the things I really enjoyed about the first two projects was talking to readers and working with readers, and this project was conceived as a way to move onto another level to actually allow those readers to sort of drive the project in a way through their creative input. So we explicitly calling them participants, and they weren't research subjects for us. They were kind of our colleagues working with us on the project. So this project was conceived around the idea of explicitly creative, participatory ways of kind of thinking about reading, but particularly, as I say, with the participants creating artifacts themselves. So out of the project they would produce their own films, and they would also gain skills in learning how to edit and tell stories and put together a digital story in the course of the project. So it kind of built from the first two projects, but also took us into a sort of slightly different direction. And I would just mention that this kind of creative approach, there are some emerging studies of other people doing similar work now. So again, instead of interviews and questionnaires and making readers read a poem together so that you can find out what they all think, thinking about stories as a way of engaging with readers. So there's a really interesting project at Roehampton which just finished called Memories Fiction. It's like an oral history of reading, and some other colleagues of mine recently have used the idea of getting readers to tell stories in a kind of workshop environment, again very similar to what we did in Reading on the Screen. So I think there's possibility, even though, as I say, this was conceived as a public engagement project, that actually out of it may develop a kind of method that could be replicated and used for studying reading. Oops. So yeah, the challenges, when I first came up with the idea and I met somebody who I was interested in working with to try to explain the project, and the first thing he said was, how are we going to make films about reading? Because it's not very exciting having people with their faces in books or holding a Kindle. So we had to kind of think quite creatively about how we could make this sort of visually interesting. So the idea was that we would be making films about reading, and that those films would be based on visual and oral materials that our participants would be contributing. So a lot of that did end up being about sort of the materiality of books. You can see here one participant brought in a set of massive encyclopedias that apparently had been the cause of a family rift, and she finally got her hands on them, and she actually brought them in, as you can see on the trolley. This was Greg from one of our workshops, who had the most amazing collection of pop-up books. It was like sort of an exhibition that he brought in one day. And we also used things like photo safari, sending people out onto the streets to take photos and bring them back and think about how they could possibly use them to tell a story, as well as people creating their own drawings. And we had somebody who created a decoupage one day just in the course of the workshop. She was just beavering away with the scissors, and next thing she produced this amazing decoupage. So the project actually consisted of then a collaboration between Bournemouth University, a colleague at Brighton, a digital storytelling company called Digitales, and a reading charity called the Reading Agents. So Digitales, this is the sort of team who helped me on the project. They brought the expertise in terms of running the workshops, encouraging participants to develop their story ideas, and then giving them the skills to be able to go on to the computers to edit and create the digital stories. So the outcomes of the project, over the course of 3 workshops, we produced around 25 short films. about 2 to 3 minute long films, and these were produced in 3-day workshops, so consecutive days, quite intensive, and at the end of the workshops, every participant who lasted the distance had produced a story, and then we sat and watched the stories together, which was the most wonderful experience, actually sitting with people, seeing their own films for the first time and watching each other's. It was really, really great. We also created some films, sort of like documentary style films, I suppose, about how we made the films, the process of the workshops. And then at the end of the project, we invited the storytellers to come and talk about their experiences at an event in Brighton, and you can see they were sort of, people could see information about the project, see the films, and meet other participants from various workshops. So we had one workshop in Bournemouth, one in Sheffield, and one in Brighton. And the exhibition was the first time that they kind of were all brought together. Okay, I'll just explain what the digital story in this sense is, because it is quite a specific method, I suppose, and philosophy. Jean Burgess, who's an internet theorist, has described it as a form of vernacular creativity. So the idea is they're often used in the context of working with disempowered people or marginalised communities and empowering them to tell their stories in their own way with fairly raw materials. They're not intended to be, high production value films. They're very personal stories made by the storytellers themselves from beginning to end, with obviously support from the facilitators. So it starts, the idea for the digital storytelling may come as a surprise, started in America, and you start with a kind of story circle idea, where people introduce themselves, tell stories maybe about themselves. So in our case, I think we shared stories about some of our earliest memories of reading, that kind of thing. And from that we developed to various activities where we sometimes we created short scripts and short stories collaboratively and just started sort of working up ideas. At the end of the first day we sent participants home and asked them to bring back on day 2 photographs, artifacts, maybe pieces of music that they thought they might be able to use in their films, and also things that had some connection perhaps to their reading lives, that they would be able to work with on day 2 as they develop their stories. So you can see here that one of the activities was stories about things we found in books. Now there's a whole world of research on marginalia and the joys of what you can find in books, from coffee stains to perhaps very profound, moving, perhaps little snippets of information about people that may have been left in a book around. So that produced some quite nice ideas. So then we moved on to people sort of starting to work individually on their stories, and in a couple of cases people really got into the making of kind of stop motion animation and all the rest of it, and developed or discovered these creative skills perhaps that they never really knew that they had, which took many different forms. So some people took naturally to writing stories and recounting stories. For others, perhaps it was more making something that inspired them. And then you can see these are 3 participants from Bournemouth. This is Mary, who'd never been in front of an iMac in her life, was absolutely terrified, but did manage to make a story. So this was the sort of editing phase on day 3, where having kind of done the sort of storyboarding of their stories, come up with the concepts. We moved on to starting to edit the music and the visuals and so on. And this is another screening from Sheffield, where some of the participants brought in friends and family to watch the films as well. We had popcorn and things. This was really, again, a really nice kind of way to round off the 3 days. So I'm just going to show a couple of stories now. I think it's a long time. It's always easier to explain the project by showing the wonderful stories that people made. And this is our website. There's all sorts of information, blog pieces, some of which have been written by our participants, some background to the project, news about a lot of the different events that we ran, and the stories themselves. So I'm going to show 2 stories, which I think it's always difficult to pick out of the collection of stories because they're so different and they're all so wonderful in their own way. And I was going to show Kindle versus Book by Hazel because, first of all, it's very funny, and this is one of the people we actually had to almost say to in the end, stop working on the animation because she was just getting completely carried away. It was turning into Wallace and Gromit or something. And also I think it's a good example. Not all of the stories mentioned the digital explicitly, but this was one of the ones that did. Decided consciously that she had another story apparently, but she felt that other story was too personal and that she would be too emotional